Now, in between the British decision to leave Palestine and the operations of the Jewish army to cleanse the Palestinians, the international community offered a solution for Palestine, dividing Palestine into two states, which was rejected by the Palestinians and the Arab states because it was not negotiated with them. It was an idea that was negotiated between the United Nations and the Zionist movement. If the United Nations would have acted in normal conditions, I would have said that it would have said that if the majority of the people of a land do not accept a peace plan, you start looking for another peace plan. You don't say, if you didn't accept this peace plan, we don't care. And that's what the United Nations did. Far more important is not so much, I think, the United Nations partition resolution as a peace plan. Much more important is that the United Nations partition resolution of November 1947 offered legitimacy to the idea of a Jewish state. For the first time since the Zionist project began, the international community gave legitimacy to the Jewish state. It also suggested where would be the borders of the Jewish state. It suggested that the Jewish state would cover around 56% of Palestine. But from a Zionist perspective, this was not a viable state, and therefore they occupied also part of the land that the United Nations thought should be part of an Arab state. So when the Jewish state came into being, it covered 80% of Palestine. Israel today without the West Bank and without the Gaza Strip. In those 80% lived 1 million Palestinians. At the end of the war, there were only 150,000 left. Namely, 850,000 Palestinians were expelled by force by Israel from the area that became the Jewish state. Now, such an operation in international law is called ethnic cleansing. Such an operation in international law is a crime against humanity. Such an operation in international law is something that the people and the state and the organization that commit it have to be accountable for. And if you go to the State Department website and you look for how the State Department today defines ethnic cleansing, also look to the suggestion that the Americans have how to solve cases of ethnic cleansing. And the Americans say very loud and clear that in places where people were forcefully expelled, they have the right to come back, regardless of what happened in the area from which they were expelled. Now, the American website lists all the cases in history of ethnic cleansing. Of course, Palestine is not among them. But what they define as ethnic cleansing fits very well to what happened in 1948 in Israel and Palestine. The motive for ethnically cleansing Palestine was a formula that all the Zionist factions believed in. That you cannot have a viable Jewish entity anywhere in the world, not only in Palestine. You cannot have a viable Jewish entity if that entity is not democratic. It was an obsession, one should say. One would say even a noble obsession, that the national movement of the Jews that emerged in Europe insisted that whatever the political solution would be, it would have to be based on a democratic model. But unfortunately, something was added to this formula. It has to be a Jewish democracy. Namely, you cannot have a situation where the democratic system would not represent always a Jewish majority. So the question is, what do you do when you have a chance to create a democracy, but you don't have a Jewish majority? The answer in 1948 was very simple. If the Jews are only 1/3 of the population, we have to expel the Arabs, and then we can have a Jewish democracy. I have to stress that the obsession with democracy was such that the problem was not only the possibility of an Arab majority. From very early on, the Israeli strategist, around 1948, decided that if there would be a Palestinian minority inside Israel, it can never cross the threshold of 20 or 25%. Because they understood history very well. And they said that not everybody votes, not everybody votes in the same way in democracy, so you don't feel threatened if the Arabs in a Jewish state become 50% of the population. You already feel threatened for the Jewish nature of the state if the Palestinians become 1/4 of the population. And this is why, for instance, between 1948 to 1966, the Palestinian minority in Israel, those who were not expelled, the small number of people who were not expelled, were put under military rule. And in many ways, the military rule would have continued had not Israel, because of the circumstances that developed in 1967, had to move that rule to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after the June 67 war. The June 67 war created another problem. You expel 1 million Palestinians in 1948, but you incorporate 1.5 million Palestinians in 1967. You cannot expel the Palestinians in 1967. You find an alternative way to deal with this clash between the wish to be a democracy and the demographic reality. This obsession, people who are not part of the Israeli psyche and mentality, I don't know if you can relate to the obsession with demography. With the idea that we have to know we don't only have to know in Israel how many Jews there are and how many Arabs there are, we also have to know whether the Jews are really Jews. And sometimes it becomes easy to come to Israel when there is a sense, let them be Christians, at least if they're not Arabs. Sometimes it's not that easy to be regarded as a Jew. But this exclusive idea that a state is a state of a race, of an ethnic group, and not of all its citizens, is at the heart of the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Because for whatever reason, and I don't have time to go into it, and a lot has to do with the Palestinian resistance and steadfastness and world public opinion, the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel did not succeed in getting rid of all the Palestinians. At any given moment in history, there are Palestinians in Palestine. There are even Palestinians in whatever Israelis regard as the Jewish state. Even if they are on the left and they say, you know, in order to have a Jewish democracy, we are willing to give up some of the territories we've occupied in 1967. And when they say that, the world applauds and gives Shimon Peres a Nobel Peace Prize. Although it's a racist idea. He doesn't want the territories because he wants the Jewish democracy, not because he believes in reconciliation. It's important to understand that. But this is a trick that can hold on for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, as the reality in 2013 shows us. It doesn't work. Israeli Jews, to this very moment, are still faced with the same predicament that the early Zionists faced when they came to Palestine. Palestine is an Arab country. Palestine has a population which is indigenous and native. And if you still believe that you can create a Jewish democracy without the native population, that in numbers is as many as you are, and if you add the refugees, in fact, it's far many more than you are. If you don't understand that this is what you have to solve, then the conflict would go on forever. It would go on forever. Even if you decide that the Jewish state would be smaller than it is today, even if you decide that all the Palestinians would be citizens without citizens' rights, it doesn't matter. You will morally, not politically, not practically, but morally and ethically, you would be an apartheid state. It doesn't matter whether you offer the Palestinians and Israel equal rights. That's what Israelis don't understand. They will tell you, but Palestinians and Israel have equal rights. They have equal rights as long, although they don't have, but let's say that they do even. I don't think that they have. But let's say that they have. Let's say that we are from the Ministry of the Israeli Foreign Affairs, and we believe that the Palestinians and Israel are equal citizens. They have equal rights as long as they are 20% of the population. They won't have equal rights if they are 25% of the population, because then you won't have a Jewish democracy. This is an amazing occupation for a society to deal with, because on the other side there are great achievements in technology, in reviving the Hebrew language, in bringing immigrants from different countries, in creating a vibrant society. There's a lot to be admired about the Zionist project. But somehow you find it very difficult to explain to Israelis that all these achievements are worth nothing if they continue to be obsessed with the question of demography, which is a very nice word that covers actually an obsession with race and racism. The tragic existence of Zionism is that the reasons that brought Zionism to life, the European racism, the European anti-Semitism, is now the main measure by which the Zionist movement tries to sustain itself, by keeping the purity of the Jewish race. This is a terrible historical development. But beyond the ethical issue, I think also practically, eventually, it would not hold water. It would not hold water. You could not forever mesmerize the world, misinform the world, that your obsession with counting how many Palestinians there are, and that you are entitled to do all kinds of things so that the Palestinians will not be a majority, is something that a normal democratic state is doing. I would finish by attracting your attention to how the Israelis are misinforming the West. It's very interesting. They created an equation between the migrants in Europe and the Palestinians. Most of my colleagues in Israeli universities write articles about the Palestinians in Israel and compare them to the Muslim minority in Britain. And they say, well, you know, also Britain doesn't always treat very well its Muslim immigrants, which is true. I'm sure also the Czech Republic is not always very good towards its immigrants. But the Palestinians are not immigrants. The Jews are the immigrants. This ability to create a dictionary which is upside down. The immigrants say, we are the native. They say that the natives are immigrant. And then they want you to check how they treat the immigrants, the natives, as immigrants. And then, of course, you can say it's not too bad. The Palestinians can vote, they can be elected, they even get their own schools. Show me another country that treats its immigrants like this. And you say, hello, you are the immigrants. They're not the immigrants. So this treatment is not comparable. It's not relevant at all. The relevant question is, how are Jews in America treated compared to how Palestinians are treated in Israel? Now, if I did this exercise, and with this I will end, I compared all the Israeli laws that discriminate against the Palestinians. I compared the language that Israeli politicians, academics, and cultural elite uses about the Palestinians in Israel and the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and compared it to the American law, and what would have happened if a similar language, a similar policy, and a similar laws would be applied against the Jews in the United States. We would describe the United States of America as a Nazi state. No other way of doing it. We would condemn the United States as the new anti-Semitic empire if an American politician would be allowed to talk about the Jews the way that an Israeli politician talks about the Palestinians, whether they are inside Israel or outside Israel, doesn't matter. Or if you compare the laws of land ownership, of social rights, of medical rights, if you compare, of course, the attitude to the Palestinians in the West Bank, and put, instead of the Palestinian, the Jewish community in the United States. Do this exercise. Because if you do that exercise, you will understand how we have to begin to analyze the reality in Israel and Palestine. And without the proper analysis, you will not have the right prognosis. You will not have the right solution. Israel is a settler colonialist state. Not the only one in the world. Australia is a settler colonialist state. South Africa is a settler colonialist state. The United States of America is a settler colonialist state. The Palestinians are lucky in a certain extent, because in many cases settler colonialist movements genocided the local people. I don't know if it's a great relief for the Palestinians to know that they were not genocided but only ethnically cleansed. But that's true. They're still there. They're still there. But the settler colonialist states, apart from Israel, and the last one was South Africa, at least are beginning to face their past, are beginning to understand what it means to have native rights, to have indigenous rights. A peaceful solution is not between Israel and the PA. It's not even between Israel and the PLO. It's between the Jews who understand that they are a third generation of settlers who come to a reconciliation and agreement on how to live together with the native indigenous people of the land, including those who were expelled in 1948 and after 1948. Thank you very much.